Okay, I just started the recording, so I'm going to turn it over to Chris Mayers.
Okay. Got it. There we go. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Tuesday afternoon lecture. We are very lucky today to have Dr. Rizzo of Colby College, who is an associate professor of Italian language and literature, and his research interests. So he got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD all from UCLA, magnificent institution. And his research interests are Renaissance and contemporary poetry, translations, semiotics, and aesthetics. We're very lucky to have him this afternoon. I know that my preceptor is very excited as we were talking about Dante this morning in both of my sections, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So over to you, Dr. Rizzo. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation, and to the organizers and everybody who's behind this recurring invitation to join you and talk about Dante. I really appreciate it, and it's one of my favorite authors. So any chance I get to talk about him, I'm very, very happy. Right. Couple of housekeeping things. So the whole thing is going to run about 50 minutes, I think. So there's going to be plenty of time to have questions and discussion afterwards. If you have a question and you want to note it down in the chat, do so, and then we'll get to them afterwards. But it's always a good thing to have that option, so you can put it out there and then keep following our conversation. Okay, and then I have a PowerPoint, and I'll try to use it not too much, but it's nice to have visuals in this type of lectures. It helps get the meaning across, but also you might get tired of looking at me after a little while. But okay, so what do we do today? Let me pull it up. Let's make sure that this works. So what I want to talk about today, let's start with the first slide. Three things mainly I want to do. The first one is to show to you how popular the Divine Comedy is in contemporary culture, and not only Italian culture, but Western culture more in general. It's one of those books that just won't go away. It's very much with us today. The second thing I want to do is to give you a bit of background on Dante's works and times. What is it that made Dante the unique historical figure that he is, and what other works did he write that we want to know about? And finally, I want to spend the last third of the class of the lecture to talk about one particular passage of the Divine Comedy, and that is the Canto 3, which is a rather important canto for myself. It's one that I've been going back time and again, especially in recent times, because it deals with the issue of polarization, which I feel is a crucial one for our contemporary society, not only again in the US, but also in Italy, in Western democracies in general. So we can go back to Dante to help us think through these problems. And so we'll get started. I'll go back to our PowerPoint. And the opening slide, this is the first example I want to show you how present Dante is in contemporary culture. This is Mickey Mouse, the cover of Mickey Mouse. That is Topolino in Italian. Topo means mouse, so Topolino, a little mouse, Mickey Mouse. And you can see him dressed up like Dante in the traditional portrait that we have of him. And he's penning his own Inferno. Then on the right-hand side, you have Paperino. You can see it here, Paperino written. That is Donald Duck, the Italian name of Donald Duck. And that is to say that both Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck have, these is comic books that all Italian children grow up reading. In fact, many people learn how to read using them. And these are retellings of the Divine Comedy, Inferno in particular, through this medium, through comic books. So it's adapted for a very young audience. And that is to say that Italians start familiarizing themselves with Dante and the Divine Comedy from a very early age. The other slide that I have here now is a collection of a bunch of stuff that came out last year. 2021 was the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, of the date of his death. And so there were plenty of celebrations in Italy, but also in Europe. Here I have the Madrid city, city of Dante, it says here. So even in other capitals of Europe, Dante was celebrated as one of the key authors of the Western canon. You have books down here, 3 covers of books that came out last year, dealing with Dante, his biography, which is an endless, fascinating topic. Then his connection with Italian democracy, Italian Republic. And finally, this is some sort of a travel log that goes through Dante places throughout Italy. And then you have the city of Ravenna, had a bunch of initiatives to celebrate Dante, Verona, and then Florence. And these are 3 cities that are very important for Dante's biography. He was born in Florence, and then exiled. So this is the 700th big anniversary, and a lot of people were interested in organizing events to celebrate it. So when we talk about this type of celebrations, the popularity that Dante has, all these different issues, we are talking about his permanence in contemporary culture. But this is not something that is uniform or that never changes. There are many different ways in which the presence of Dante can be felt. And so here I have a slide that tries to make a bit of a summary of the ways in which culture can use Dante, can be influenced by Dante. And we go from the left, from the mere reading of the Divine Comedy, that is, you pick up the book and you read it. Then you have a more involved way of interpreting it. And so people write articles, books even, on certain aspects of the Divine Comedy. And then you have translation, which is a very special way of dealing with a work of art, where you really try to render it in a different language, if you're doing translation proper, or you adapt it to some other medium, for instance. We saw the comic books earlier, but it could be different things. Movies have been made of the Divine Comedy, operas, and then all sorts of different adaptation. And then you have 2 other ways of dealing with it, of feeling the influence of Dante. One is the appropriation, the other the exploitation. Appropriation is when you are imposing your own agenda on Dante's own work. You don't care so much what he wants to say, what the text wants to say, but you want to use Dante for some other issue that you want to prove. And then you have just commercial exploitation. You are peddling some sort of wares, and you are using Dante's image, his cultural capital, if you will, just to do that, to get people to pay attention and buy your product. And I would like to start from this last bit, the exploitation, because it's fun. It just shows you the variety of ways in which people have been appropriating Dante. So Dante's Inferno is hot, therefore it stands to reason that if you make hot sauce, you call it after Dante. And so here we have 2 examples of Dante's Inferno and Dante's, so spelled a little different, Inferno hot sauce. The other one on the right is an example of, this is the Italian equivalent of the WD-40, that little spray that you use to do pretty much anything around the house. In Italian it's called svito, and then, whenever you are without svito, life is hell, it says the caption here. So that's, again, no relation with the Divine Comedy, just a way of appropriating its cultural capital. Other examples, we have board games after Dante's Divine Comedy. Board games after Dante's Divine Comedy. We have here some coffee that somehow has been named after Dante's Inferno. Fine pens, this is a very pretty example. Olive oil, and then a rather humiliating use of Dante's work. Here is portrayed as holding up a roll of toilet paper. The idea behind being the toilet paper roll is so long that he can fit his whole Divine Comedy on it, writing it by hand. Again, other examples. This is the Olivetti on the left, a very famous maker of typewriters, then personal computers, now all sorts of small appliances. This is an ad from the 30s, and Dante is shown pointing to the Olivetti typewriter. The idea being, if Dante were alive in the 30s, surely he would have used an Olivetti machine to type up his masterpiece. You can buy mugs with sort of quotations from the Divine Comedy. Here's an example. If you are into the do-it-yourself type of lifestyle, this chain of sort of stores, kind of like Home Depot, wants to remind you that probably Dante was a do-it-yourself type of guy too. We see him in profile. Again, no association with the Divine Comedy, just with the fame that Dante brings. And then finally, we have here an ad for one of the Italian phone companies. Surely, if you find yourself in hell, you want to call for help, and so you want to have a good reception. And they're advertising here their package for tablet and internet and so on at a very good price. And you can see Dante on the left, and then Virgil on the right, and in the middle, Lucifer, Satan himself, marveled at the price that he can get on this phone deal. So this is a very, if you will, silly way of showing you how current Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante's name, the imagery that he deploys throughout his masterpiece, how current they are in contemporary Italian culture. Some of those examples, though, were not Italian, they were sort of Western more in general. So this is for that exploitation and appropriation part of the continuum that we saw. There are also ways that are less controversial, more sort of conventional ways of sort of using Dante, making it current. And that is the what I was calling interpretation in that little slide. And I just want to show you an example, something that I published a little while back. This is a collection of essays titled Like Something That Desire. That's a line from Dante in Longfellow's translation. And this is a collection of essays that have to do with Dante's life in 20th century literature and cinema, as the subtitle here reads. Just, this is what people do. They read Dante, they write essays about them, but also they track his influence in contemporary culture. So this is a very well-established series of studies in Dante studies. But then there are other books that are written that have less to do with Dante, and they are, exploitative in many ways. This is the cover of Dan Brown's Inferno, one of his latest novels. And here is Dan Brown himself with the first page of his book. Now, here Dante is not really engaged. I mean, he doesn't go into the text. He doesn't take from the imagery. It's just some color that Dan Brown adds to his usual plot of word intrigue and spy stories and the usual sort of things that made him famous. I took this one from the first page just to show you a couple of things about his style. Dan Brown writes, I pass behind, this is the very beginning of the book, so it's just starting off. I pass behind the palazzo with its crenellated tower and one-hand clock, snaking through the early morning vendors in Piazza di San Firenze with their hoarse voices smelling of lampredotto and roasted olives. That is just to say that his version of Italy is a hyper-Italian Italy, right? So you see the insertion of borrowings from, lexical borrowings from Italian, palazzo, piazza, lampredotto, just to make sure that we know exactly where we are in case we got distracted. We are in Italy. Crenellated is a very rare word that means ramparts, those towers that have those little protruding bits so that you can hide from the assailants that are throwing arrows at you. And what really shows you here is that Dan Brown is not interested in engaging with Dante, but more he wants to exploit Dante and his connection with Italy as one of the colors in his plot in his novel. But the other question that this raises is there a way of using Dante that is not commentary, like that book that we saw, but it's also not exploitative? Meaning, is there a way of using Dante to do something else that is also respectful of Dante, and it's actually useful, adds something to the world rather than subtracting something to the world? And I think that that's very much true and possible. And I have a few examples of this way of using the Divine Comedy without being exploitative. The first one is Sequestrum Uomo, This is a Man, a crucial book in the 20th century by Primo Levi. Primo Levi was an Italian Jew, an intellectual, a writer, and as an Italian Jew, during Nazi occupation of Italy, he was deported to Auschwitz, the concentration camp, and he survived it. And so after the war, he spent the rest of his life writing about the experience in the concentration camps in the hopes of warning and people against it and making sure that such a tragedy will never occur again. When he writes Sequestrum Uomo, This is a Man in 1947, so it's very close to the experience of the internment in these concentration camps, he has a very precise problem as a narrator, as a writer. He needs to make this outlandish, horrifying experience present, understood by his audience. How can you fathom what the concentration camp was like if you never experience it? It is such a absurd, horrifying experience that words fail, right? That was the problem that he had. And so in order to create a connection between himself, the survivor, and the reader, he resorted to the Divine Comedy as something to pin on his experience, as a common ground that he shared with his readers so that he could make the experiences, the emotions, the images that he witnessed present to them, understandable to them. So you see, he's not interpreting the Divine Comedy, he's using it, but he's using it for a very specific purpose, a very useful one, right? Making sure that something as horrifying as that doesn't happen again. This also shows us how many exploited, oppressed people throughout history have turned to Dante as a fellow human being, a brother, somebody who understood what they were going through. This is a constant. Throughout Europe, throughout the world, people look at Dante as somebody who can understand their plight, who can sympathize, who they can see as a fellow human being that went through similar experiences. Now, another example of using the Divine Comedy to precisely this effect is by Robert Rauschenberg, who was a painter, very famous, very renowned. And here on this slide, we have two examples of his Dante drawings, which he made between 1958 and 1960, and it's 34 drawings, one per canto of Inferno. Rauschenberg, as you know, was a gay painter. He was very much present in the cultural space as a gay painter, so that was one very strong part of his identity. And as you know, Dante condemns homosexuality in the comedy Inferno as a sin. So you have a gay painter dealing with homosexuality in public in a time when in American culture, this is very much something that is not allowed, is not okay. And he does that by inhabiting Dante's Inferno, that space, that literary space. What I want to point out to you, so this is a very interesting, very smart way of dealing with this issue, but I want to point you to a very specific tool that Rauschenberg borrows from Dante, you can see from these images that there are a lot of small bits of other images that are transferred onto this surface by basically rubbing it with some chemical agent. And these are all images taken from newspapers, magazines, sort of mass-produced literature that Rauschenberg took and then applied on these surfaces. So this is images, people from current events that then he incorporates in his own creation. And that's exactly what Dante does in the Divine Comedy. It's full of stories of people that were his contemporaries, people that his audience would know about. They would be household names. So what Rauschenberg does is more than just take issue with Dante's condemnation of homosexuality. He uses Dante's rhetorical tools to make his point. Right? So he borrows from Dante and he uses it for his own point. The last example that I'll give you, and then I'll pause for a second, is Amir Baraka, Leroy Jones, The System of Dante's Hell, which is a slender booklet that came out in 1965 and then came out twice, two more times later on with sort of minor changes. Amir Baraka, then Leroy Jones, published this book in 1965. It has to do with what it feels like, what it is like to be a black intellectual in the America of 1960s. And as a New Yorker, as Amir Baraka was, going on a trip to the South. How do you experience yourself being transported in what felt like hell, an inferno, a place that was completely otherworldly? And so you see again, Amir Baraka, he died recently in 2014. He was a professor of literature. He was a crucial author in the 20th century American literature, a renowned poet. He has a problem that is similar to that of Primo Levi that we saw earlier. He needs to find a way of conveying these feelings, of finding some common ground with his reader. And Dante offers that. The Divine Comedy is a middle ground on which he can meet the reader and make them understand what it feels like to go on a journey like the one he just experienced. And so if we stop here for a moment, we can see how the presence of the Divine Comedy in contemporary culture is very much variegated. There is all sorts of ways in which people use the Divine Comedy, some more interesting, some less interesting. And the last part of this lecture, I want to go back especially to Amir Baraka and his The System of Dante's Hell, because I think it really helped me understand better that passage, Canto 3, which I wanted to read with you. So before we go there, I thought it would be a good idea to take some time to fill in the background, to talk a little bit about Dante, his biography, and the other works that he wrote. And so very quickly, let me pull up the PowerPoint again. Here we are. So very quickly, a few notes about Dante's life. There are three things, I think, that are crucial to know about Dante. The first one is his passion for politics. Dante cannot conceive existing in a public space without being active politically. To be a political activist and to be alive are one and the same. And in fact, he was very active in Florence, so much so that in the year 1300, he was elected prior. That is the highest office that you can have in the Republic of Florence of the time. But this passion for politics also determined the second important event in his life, that is his exile from Florence in 1302. What happened is that the opposing party took power after Dante's tenure as a prior, and they outlawed, they banished all the most prominent members of the opposing and now losing party. So Dante, for no fault of his own, was banished from Florence, the city that he loved most on earth. And he spent the rest of his life pining for his Florence, wanting to go back and being denied that consolation. So politics is the first important factor of Dante's life. The second is exile that then he turned into an existential condition. And one way in which you can think of this is religiously, Dante being a Christian, he thought of his life here on earth as being on an exile from heaven, from the afterlife. So this becomes something that colors his entire existence. Everything is seen through the eyes of this exile. And this is also what makes him so appealing to people oppressed everywhere. All this oppression can be seen as a banishment, as being treated as somebody that is not wanted, and so relegated to a second class citizen, if you will. The last thing that is important in Dante's biography is his encounter with Beatrice in 1274, so very early. Now, the romantic view of this is that Dante fell in love with him and dedicated all his poems to Beatrice. It's not quite that simple. Dante in fact, he married someone else, Gemma Donati, in 1289. Dante's relationship with Beatrice is one that is mediated by religion. His thinking is that Beatrice was a messenger, an angel in the sense, in the etymological sense of the word. Angelos in Greek, ancient Greek, is the messenger. So it's the messenger that God sent to earth to call Dante to the right way, to bring him back from the from being astray. And so this is, in Dante's mind, the single most important event of his life, because it's a sign of a direct intervention of God in his own biography. Everything that he has done afterward is because he met Beatrice, and he understood that as the miracle that he was intended to be. So these three important events in his life. What are his main works? Well, Dante is the kind of writer that even if he hadn't written the Divine Comedy, he would still be part of the Western canon, because he wrote the Rime, that is the poems, which is a group of lyric poems that he added to throughout his life, and that would alone constitute title enough to be remembered in the Western canon. They're absolutely excellent poems. But also he wrote the Vita Nuova, which is a reinterpretation of a traditional form, where we have poems in verse, naturally, and commentary in prose to those poems, and both are speak to one another. And this is called prosimetro in Italian. And this form was a traditional form of Arab poetry, which he brought into Western poetry, the Western tradition. And again, this book alone is a title for being included in the canon. Then he wrote the De Vulgari Eloquentia, which is a partial treatise on the search of poetic language. Dante decided to write his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, in vernacular. Now, books of this kind of scope and ambition at this point in time in Europe would have been written normally in Latin, which was the language of scholar pursued poetry and allowed these texts to travel throughout Europe. So the choice that Dante makes of writing the Divine Comedy in Italian is a momentous one, because it marks the beginning, basically, of the modern era in Europe and of Italian literature in Italy. And this is the treatise where he explains his reasons. He tries to make
something from like over here, but it's really over there, and make it colored.
Okay. He tries to make his point across. And then finally, the Monarchy and the Convivio. The Monarchy is a political treatise, again, in Latin, again, a way of Dante to show how important politics is in his own life. And then the Convivio is a sort of encyclopedia that is not finished, but it aspires to contain all of the knowledge that was available to the Middle Age, the medieval man. And in a sense, that the Commedia, the Divine Comedy, is the fulfillment of that unfinished work, because the Commedia is a compendium of knowledge in its own way. Finally, we have the Divine Comedy, Commedia, the way Dante would have pronounced that title. And it's a comedy in the sense that it is a style that is in between the tragedy and the farce. So it's a middle ground style. And it's a comedy in the sense that it starts from a crisis and it ends on a positive note. Traditionally in theater, comedies begin with somebody dying, some sort of crisis that subverts the order. And then comedies usually end with a wedding. That's the traditional ending of a comedy. In this case, it begins with Dante lost in the forest of sin, and it ends with Dante witnessing the Holy Trinity, God himself, right? So it's a comedy in that sense. A few basic information points about the Divine Comedy. It's written, as we said, in vernacular Italian. It is in terza rima, that is in tercets that are rhyming in a very original way, where the first and the third verse of the tercet rhyme between them, and then the second rhymes with the first of the next tercet, and so on and so forth. This is called rima incatenata, chained tercet. And the idea is that you are propelled forward in your reading by that connection created by the second verse, the first and the third of the next rhyme. This is a mechanism of keeping you moving forward. As we said, there are three canticles, three parts to the Divine Comedy: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. We are going to be seeing only Inferno. Each of these canticles are made out of 33 cantos, plus one beginning, sort of introductory canto at the very beginning, that makes up 100. Numbers are very important in Dante's world. His Inferno, for instance, is composed of 9 circles, and then there is one vestibule or anteroom at the very beginning. 1 and 9, 10. Again, number 3, number 9, number 1, and number 10 are very important. In Purgatory, there are 7 levels, plus 3 terraces. That's 7 plus 3, 10. Again, 7 and 3 and 10. And finally, in Paradise, there are 9 heavenly spheres, and then there is the Empyrean, the place where all the saved, blessed souls are gathered, and that's 9 plus 1, 10. These verses are peopled with hundreds and hundreds of characters that Dante takes from everyday life, as we were saying, common stories that were shared across the peninsula in Europe, historical figures, mythological figures. So he puts together a very lively mixture of people that his audience would know about, stories that were very well known. And then when it comes to the timeline of his voyage into the afterlife, it begins on the Good Friday, so the Friday before Easter of the year 1300, which is a Jubilee year. And then it lasts for 10 days. So Dante comes away from heaven on the Sunday of the following, the Sunday following Easter Sunday, making the journey last a total of 10 days. Again, the importance of numbers. So again, a couple of words about the structure of Inferno, because we need it for later. Imagine that Inferno is like a funnel, a hole that is underneath the city of Jerusalem, a tiered one made with terraces, and then it's organized hierarchically. At the very center of it is Lucifer, the rebel angel that God cast down on earth in that first cosmic battle. And closest to him are the worst sinners, those who betrayed trust. Those are the worst sinners in Dante's mind. And then, as you go further away on the surface, toward the surface, you have lesser offenders, as it were. And in fact, the very first terrace of Dante's Inferno, Limbo, is peopled by souls that didn't even sin. But they're sort of, the reason why they're there is because they didn't know the true faith, what Dante thought of as true faith. That is, Jesus. They were either born before the coming of Jesus, or they were not baptized. And so you have very young infants in this part of Inferno. And so, as I said, very important numbers. The hierarchy of it, at the very core, is the Satan, Lucifer, the outcast, the angel, the rebel angel that God cast out. And then here we have another view of the same sort of funnel from above. I like it because this is a picture from Wiki Travel. The idea that, Inferno is somewhere where you can go and have tourists get lost, and you might need a little bit of a chart to find your way out. Okay, so I'll pause here for another moment, just to say that the first bit that we did had to do with Dante's popularity in contemporary culture, and we saw how diverse that popularity can be. It can go from a very superficial engagement to a very meaningful use of Dante as a stepping stone to something else that these intellectuals wanted to do. Then we saw a little bit about Dante, life and works. Especially, I want to emphasize how important politics was to him, and how he was the victim of a divided state, a polarized state. His exile is due to the fact that the party who came to power after him decided that they wanted to ban and banish all the most prominent members of the opposing party. So it was a very polarized society, perhaps more than our own today, right? So those are the things I wanted to emphasize. Now, one good question at this stage that we can ask is, what makes the Divine Comedy so long-lasting? What makes the Divine Comedy so productive? Why do people keep reading it and interpreting it and appropriating it? Well, one way of answering that question is to say that the Divine Comedy is a classic, right? And so classics in general, in literature in particular, are those texts that people like to go back to. But it is really substituting one question for another, because then we ask, what is a classic? What makes a work of literature or work of art a classic? Well, I have here on this next slide a quotation from an essay by Italo Calvino, another prominent Italian intellectual of the second half of the 20th century, who wrote this essay entitled in English, Why Read the Classics? It's an essay organized in points, sort of like short answers to this question. Why is it a good idea to read the classics? And I want to read with you part of number 6 and number 7. So Calvino writes, a classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say, which is a nice way to put it, right? The idea is it's such a complex, layered work that we always go back to it and find new things. It never finishes saying what it has to say. And then the next, number 7, I think, does a better job at explaining how that happens, why it is that it's never done. Calvino writes, the classics are the books that come down to us, bearing upon them the traces of readings previous to ours, and bringing in their wake the traces they themselves have left on the culture or cultures that they have passed through, or more simply, on language and custom. What does he mean? He means very simply that classics not only are interesting because they're complex, but also because as people go back to them and reinterpret them over and over again, they leave on them traces of their own interpretations. And so as time goes by, these classics become ever more layered, ever more complex, ever more relevant and interconnected with our culture. So this is, I think, a good starting point for us to think of how we can use contemporary readings, different readings, so readings that have to do with Dante, but from different angles than our own, to refresh the classics, to make them, again, new and interesting to us. But sometimes it's also the case that a perspective that is not our own can help us better appreciate and better understand a specific passage of these classics. Now, what I want to do next is to go to that canto third that I mentioned at the very beginning. This is a passage that for the longest time has puzzled me. There was something here that fascinated me and at the same time didn't quite sit well with me. Dante is talking about a group of people. We are in the antechamber, in the sort of entryway, if you will, of Inferno. And I'll just read it in a moment, but something in this passage didn't quite sit right with me, because Dante here shows the punishment that is given to those people who in life did not choose a side. And what bothered me is that he was an exile, Dante was an exile, because of an excess of partisanship in his own Florence. So why would he reserve such a horrible punishment to people that did not exercise that kind of punishment in life? Something didn't quite match for me, and that bothered me for a long time. And then I read a few other books that sort of cast a new light on the issue, and I think now I have a better solution as to why Dante wrote the way he did. But let's take it in steps, and the first thing I want to do is to read with you this passage, and I'll read the Italian, and I'll let you read the translation that is next to it on the slide. But then at the very end, because I want you to get an idea of what Dante sounds like in Italian. And then at the end, I'll go over the salient points with you, so don't worry, I'll repeat all the important points for my argument at the very end. And then finally, I'll make my argument, and let's see if you guys buy it or not. Okay, so again, we are in canto third. We are here, the vestibule, the very top of Dante's Inferno. And you can see here they're called indifferent. There are different names for this group of people, but we'll get into it in a second. So here it goes, right, in Italian, and then you guys follow the English. E io che avea d'error la testa cinta, dissi, maestro, che è quel che odo? E che gente è che parla nel duol si vinta? Ed egli a me, questo misero modo tegna l'anime triste di coloro che vissero senza infame e senza lodo. Mischiate sono a quel cattivo coro degli angeli, che non furono ribelli, né fu fedeli a Dio, ma per sé fuoro. Caccianvi i ciel per non essere membelli, né lo profondo inferno li riceve, d'alcuna gloria i re avè verdelli. E io, maestro, che è tanto greve allor che lamentar li fa sì forte? Rispose, dicerolti molto breve. Questi non hanno speranza di morte, e la lor cieca vita è tanto bassa, che invidiosi son d'ogni altra sorte. Fama di loro il mondo essere non lassa, misericordia e giustizia li sdegna, non ragionando di loro, ma guarda e passa. E io che riguardai vidi un'insegna che girando correa tanto ratta, che d'ogni cosa mi parea indegna. E dietro le veniasi lunga tratta di gente, che io non avrei creduto che morte tanta ne avesse disfatta. Poscia che vedi alcun riconosciuto, vidi e conobbi l'ombra di colui che fece per viltade il gran rifiuto. Incontanente intesi e certo fui, che questa era la schiera, la setta di cattivi, a Dio spiacenti e a nemici sui. Questi sciaurati, che mai non fu vivi, erano ignudi e stimolati molto da mosconi e da vespe che erano ivi. Elle rigavan loro di sangue il volto, che mischiato di lacrime, a lor piedi, da fastidiosi vermi, era ricolto. Okay, so this is a lot of Italian that I just threw at you, but you saw the mechanism of the tercet that I was describing. This rhythm propels you forward and forward as you're reading. Now, on this slide, I have an illustration by Primo della Quercia of this precise canto, this precise passage. The illustration is from the 15th century, so the 1400s. That is about a century, less than a century after Dante wrote it. Here you can see on the left, Dante and Virgil, Dante being the one in blue, Virgil in red, on the threshold of Inferno. This gate is marks the beginning of hell, of Inferno. They cross in, they come in on the other side, and they see this group of condemned souls that are standing around this banner, the banner that Dante describes. We can't quite make out what the banner is, what it shows, what it depicts. And then these are naked souls. We can see their flesh being tormented by bugs, right, that bited them. And we can see the little streaks of blood running down their limbs. So it's a rather gruesome image that Dante paints and that Primo della Quercia shows us. And it's one that is made of different components. So here I have a list of those elements that I want to make sure we focus on. The first important notation that Dante gives us is that of noise. There is a wall of noise that invests them as they come into this space. And it's not just Italian. It is voices and languages from all over the world. So this sort of place is not peopled only by singers that come from the Italian peninsula, but it's actually a global phenomenon. Who are these people in this place? Well, they are those who lived without blame and without praise. So they didn't do anything remarkable with their lives. Also, there are those angels that in that first cosmic battle that we mentioned did not take a side. They weren't with God, they went with Lucifer, but they stood by the sidelines to wait to see who would win, presumably. Then also, the other notation that Dante makes is that how many people are there? He didn't think there would be so many people that had died since the beginning of time. So the sheer amount, this is the largest crowd he sees in the entire afterlife. And that makes us think that probably he thought that the most common condition in which people died is this condition of having done nothing worth of blame and nothing worth of praise, which is a horrible thing to think, right? There is only one person that he singles out. He says, the shade of he who out of cowardice made the great refusal. A lot of commentators have seen these as Celestine V, who was elected Pope in 1294. Celestine did something unprecedented. He stepped down. He decided not to be Pope anymore. Until Benedict XVI, about 7, 8, 9 years ago, these have been absolutely unprecedented and the only case in the history of Christianity that the Pope steps down. And Dante singles him out of this innumerable crowd. He says, I recognize he who out of cowardice made the great refusal. He refused the papacy. The other point I want to make is the placement of this crowd. Dante puts them in this liminal space that is in between the living and the dead. These souls are not located in Inferno proper, they are on the edge of it, but still on this side. And then, in spite of being on this side, so closer to the living, no memory of them is kept. Nobody knows who they are or where they are. And finally, the punishment. What are they punished to do? Well, the first thing is that they are forgotten. Nobody remembers about them. Then they have to run around this banner that they don't know what it is and never stay still, and they always have to run after it. And finally, they are bitten alive by these insects, wasps, and all sorts of bugs that cause them pain. Now, here you can see that contrapasso, that principle that regulates the afterlife according to Dante, where the sin of the sinner is turned upside down and becomes his or her punishment in the afterlife. So in this case, you have people who never pick sides that are now forced to run after a banner all the time. So they're forced to follow continuously, and they are stimulated, he says, by these insects. Very unlike in their life, where no gadfly, no sort of fixed image or recurring thought would push them to act and do something with their life. So this is the scene that Dante paints for us. And this is why, as you can see, I found myself a bit in a quandary as to why would he be so cruel and so merciless with a group of people that didn't take sides, being himself a victim of a group of people that indeed took sides a little too seriously. I'll make it short because I'm about to run out of time. What I did encounter as new readings that helped me sort of make the connection, make this make sense for me, is, as I said, the short book by Leroy Jones and Ray Baraka, The System of Dante's Hell, but also a famous debate in which James Baldwin and William F. Buckley in Cambridge in 1965 debated the question that was posed to them by the organizer, which I have here: has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? This is the question that they asked them, and this is what they were debating. Now, what does Baldwin say in his opening remarks? And by the way, if you want to watch this debate, it's absolutely crucial for understanding many things in contemporary American history, and it's available online. You can watch it at this link down here. And it's just a very fine piece of oratorial art. James Baldwin is one of the best public speakers I've ever heard, ever. So Baldwin starts with these remarks. He says, I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. It would seem to me that the question before the House, the question being, as we said, is the American dream being achieved at the expenses of the American Negro? It would seem to me that the question before the House is a proposition horribly loaded, that one's response to that question depends on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. The white South African or Mississippi sharecropper or Alabama sheriff has at the bottom a system of reality which compels them really to believe when they face the Negro that this woman, this man, this child must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. For such a person, the proposition which we are trying to discuss here does not exist. So here is, I think, this is the point that James Baldwin is making. The system of reality is such that this question becomes preposterous for those who don't share it, right? Again, the system of Dante's Hell, this is the connection here. These assumptions we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. Now, this is a concept, system of reality, that has been investigated, among others, by Antonio Gramsci in the beginning of the 20th century. Gramsci was an Italian leftist intellectual that was jailed by the fascists and died in jail. And his prison notebooks are mandatory reading in all political science courses, courses. And so what Baldwin and Baraka called system of reality is somewhere between ideology and common sense, which Gramsci defined as the folklore of philosophy. That is, that system of notions, ideas, beliefs, expectations, norms that define one's world and are seen, presented, and experienced as natural, universal, neutral, inevitable, and beneficial to all society. This is the system of reality. This is the common sense. But going back to the Divine Comedy, this is also the capital sin of that group of people that never chose, that didn't take sides. What I think Dante means is not that they never took a side in the sense that they never sort of choose the group to belong with, but they did so in a very conformist way. They didn't choose the alternative. They didn't help shape the alternatives that they were being presented with, but in a very conformist way, they just picked one of the two alternatives that was given to them. And that's the capital sin, not to shape your own options, not to decide and take a side in a strong sense of the word. This is what I call the Pepsi or Coke politics. You're given the illusion of a choice. You can pick Pepsi or Coke, but you're going to drink soda in the end, right? You're not free to shape your choices in a very strong and positive way. And so the Ignavi, this group of people that we see condemned in that first antechamber of Inferno, refused to make a choice in the strong sense of the word and elected to opt in one of the choices that they were given. That is the sort of bad partisanship, bad polarization that we see also in our own historical context. And by giving up that option, the possibility of shaping the alternatives that they then would choose, they gave up what they made them truly human, right? Truly alive. And that's why Celestine V was the one that must be sort of despised most of all, because he was given power. He was put in a very prominent position as the head of the church. He could have effected enormous change. And instead, he decided not to take that opportunity, not to shape his reality in this strong sense of the word, and he stepped down. He went back to a life of contemplation. And so I think in this way, it makes sense to me what Dante is saying. People that are there, they're not there because they simply refuse to take a side out of the two options that they were given. No, they probably did. But what they didn't do is to put in the effort, the thought, the energy to try and shape the alternatives that they were given so that they could, in fact, change the reality that was around them. And so then, to me, it makes sense that Dante was a victim of that sort of reductivist partisanship that we see active in Florence of his time and in society in our contemporary times. And he rejects that partisanship in favor of an engaged citizenship where people contribute to shape the choices that then are put on the ballot, that are shared and voted upon in democracy. And so I'll stop there. I think it was a little longer than I wanted to, but we should have more than enough time for any questions that you guys might have. Thank you for listening and for your attention.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I'm not. I guess I'm just not totally convinced that because it was pretty clearly said that the side that them not picking sides was talking about the side of Satan or the side of God. So saying that they aren't really real different choices, I don't think I'm confused. You seem to be implying that Dante claimed that Satan and God were kind of similar, and I'm not convinced that he would say that. I'm so confused.
Yeah, I see your point, and I think it's well taken, right? So he casts it in a way of pure evil versus pure good. And so there you can't really mediate that choice or sort of modulate it, right? You have to be either here or there. And so I think your point is well taken. Still, how can we square that, right? That reading, which is absolutely rooted in the text, as you point out. How can we square that reading with Dante's own biography, with how he was a victim of that type of reasoning? So we could say, on the one hand, well, he accepted it, right? And so to him, that was the way the world works. And so too bad he got on the losing side of that battle. That's it, right? But I think even if that's the case, as modern contemporary readers of Dante, it's to me more interesting what we can do with that challenge than what Dante might have thought or what the text, in fact, explicitly say. And here I'm really advocating for a misunderstanding of the text that is a useful misunderstanding in my mind. It's a way like, Rauschenberg, like Primo Levi, like Emil Baraka did, a way of using Dante's text to get a point across that is relevant in today's conversation, today's society. So again, I think your point is very well taken. I think you're right? He is casting this as a matter of evil versus good, and there is no way that a poor little soul can help shape that. But I think there is room there where I would advocate for using these as an opportunity to think through our own reality and see what we can do to be better and how we can use Dante to think through that process of being better, doing better.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think I did see a few more questions in the chat. Let's see. We can start with Britton, who posed a couple questions. Starting with the first. How do you think the Divine Comedy would have been received if Dante was not already well distinguished when he made it?
Let's see. I'm trying to find it in the chat. I don't think I see it. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah. How do you think the Divine Comedy would have been received if Dante was not already well distinguished when he made it?
Right. So Dante, I would say, I say that each of those works could be titled enough to be included in the canon of Western literature, but this is something that we can say after the fact, right? So at the time of his writing, Dante really, his fame was made by the Divine Comedy. It was a work that was immediately wildly popular and started circulating in manuscript form, even as Dante was working on it. So the Inferno started circulating before Paradise was finished. And so there wasn't really a moment when Dante was known outside of Florence for other things than his Divine Comedy. So he had cultivated a reputation of being a very refined intellectual within the city of Florence. But outside of Florence, he was known as the author of the Divine Comedy. And all these other works, they are either preceding the Divine Comedy or they moved along with the Divine Comedy. And so there wasn't really a time when he was known outside of Florence as anything but the author of the Divine Comedy.
Interesting. I'm going to hop to some other questions and get back to these Britton has a few. Rachel Pellis asks, although Dante's work isn't always referenced in the most artful of ways, is that as important as being able to carry on his message more than 700 years later? Wouldn't he have preferred for people centuries later to still be aware of his reflections on society?
Absolutely. We don't all have to hold him in reverence or try to interpret him or treat it too well, right? I'm absolutely okay with people appropriating him, mistreating him, forcing him to do things that he doesn't want to do. I think that's the sign, the resilience that the Divine Comedy has shown over 700 years. The fact that no matter what we throw at it, it still endures. They made video games out of it. They turned, that work inside out, and yet it persists, yet it endures. So to me, I would say people should knock themselves out. By all means, Dante is everybody's poet. Do with him whatever you wish. But then it's also good to sort of make distinctions, right? These conversations that we have are opportunities for us to say, okay, I wouldn't invoke the Dante police, but we also want to know, okay, that's one kind of operation of using Dante maybe against Dante's will, which is fine, right? But then there are also other ways that we can try and use Dante or interpret it or put him in context or put him in dialogue with his contemporary culture or with our modern culture. So even what I just did of trying to force this interpretation on that passage is a sort of violence that I made, I visited on the Divine Comedy. But I'm absolutely okay with it because to me it's a stepping stone to something that is very important to me. And, I would encourage anybody to do whatever they want with the Divine Comedy. That's been around for 700 years. Hopefully, if we all keep at it, it will be around for another 700 years. And that's the beauty of it.
Rachel, thanks you. And I'll ask a question that was actually recently posed. They said, I enjoyed how there are so many references to mythological creatures and figures, but why do you think there are no mentions of the gods?
The gods meaning the Greek and Roman gods?
I believe so.
Right. So I think in part, let me give a couple of answers. So in part, because not often, sometimes Dante uses periphrases in his poems to refer to God, meaning the Christian God, using definitions, sort of adjectives and appellations that belong to the pagan gods, right? So there is a conflation of Dante, of the Christian, Judeo-Christian God and Zeus, or the great sort of entities of the pagan Parthenon, as it were. So that's one answer. but also because he needs these different characters to do things for him that are very specific. He needs these demons and monsters and things, either as means of transportation, as connection between levels, as judges. I'm thinking about Karen, think about Karen, right? He ferries the souls from one place to another. So he has to, these are mechanics of the narrative that he needs to somehow fulfill. And it's a lot easier to do that with mythological figures that are not godlike. It just becomes more practical, more believable. So I think those are two possible answers to the question.
Wonderful. So I'm going to ask, Pippin Freeman asked a question, and I'm actually going to mention part of, I think it was Britton's question too.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there were, he's kind of posing two different questions, so I'll just read it out loud and see what happens. Was Dante's intention in writing the Inferno to describe his understanding of hell and his suffering, or do you think it was more inspired to produce a story inspired by Christian elements? So
yeah, that's an excellent question. So how does the universal and the individual relate to one another in Dante's Divine Comedy? That is an excellent question, a very complicated one. I'll give a brief answer, but books have been written on this issue, right? So there is a lot of bibliography. In Dante's mind, he is the representative of humanity. So he undertakes this journey that is at the same time a personal journey of he himself, the empirical individual that goes through this vision, if you will, or journey through the afterlife. But he's also a figure of all mankind. So the medieval mind, the medieval way of thinking is one in which there is no real contradiction between destiny and history, eternity and time, right? These two are one and the same because they're all willed by the God, by the divinity. And so Dante is a representative of mankind undergoing this journey, and he's coloring it with his own perceptions, his own biases, his own images that he takes from the medieval library that he has access to. And I was saying this is also an encyclopedia, right? It contains a lot of information that was available to the men of the Middle Ages. But at the same time, because of its personal characteristic, it is universal. Because it is so rooted in his own biography, in his own experience of exile, then it becomes something that can be generalized and everybody can relate to. So I might not be exiled from my country. I might be exploited in my work, right? But that condition of being lesser than someone else, that is the kernel that we have in common, and that makes Dante's message universal. And so it's very complicated, this dynamic of individual and particular circumstances, historical ones, and then sort of universal religious implications. But that's the dialectic, the dynamics that Dante builds intentionally in his own works and using his own biography. Even the idea of Beatrice as being at the same time a very specific event in his life, but a sign, a miracle that God sends into his life. And then finally, then I'll shut up about this, but this is very exciting. How can God intervene in history if he inhabits eternity? That's a difficult problem. If I am outside of time and space, how can I influence somebody like Dante who is within time and space, right? And so that's the paradox. And that's the paradox that is at the core of these. How do we reconcile the individual's history and humanity's history and its salvation, right? The aspiration to be saved.
I think that's a wonderful, even way to maybe end this lecture. That's a really cool. I hope the precepts get to talk about that question that you discussed too. So I'm happy to field more questions if students have them, or I can always direct them your way. Are there any students who have lasting questions? I don't see any popping up in the chat.
I do have one.
Yeah.
So in relation to the 9 rings of hell and some of the creatures who can be found within those rings, could you say that the sin, they also represent the sin that they keep the souls within the ring? Yeah. And so does every single ring have like a defined creature that guards or protects the ring?
Yeah, it's not quite like that. So there are some sort of general purpose creatures, devils, that are everywhere. And then you have a few key places where Dante describes some of these other creatures. I'm thinking of Charon, we already mentioned, that ferries the souls from one side to the other of Acheron. You have Geryon, which is this strange winged creature, composite made out of several different animals that Dante uses to basically ferry himself and Virgil from a high place to a lower place. There is this giant sort of leap that they need to take, and Geryon comes and takes them. But other than this, the punishments are not always enacted by creatures that sort of torment them or poke them or do things to them. More often than not, weather events, so rain, hail, cold, or sort of other. Some of the sinners have to carry around heavy things, or they are burdened by strange clothing, or their head is severed and they have to carry around. So it's not always that there is someone that is actively tormenting them, but often the torment is built in their new condition in the afterlife, and the environment is used to torment them. So Dante doesn't really need his devils to actively poke the sinners all the time, except for a few places. And so I wouldn't say that there are specific creatures assigned to specific sins, but it's more like when the narrative demands it, he uses these creatures to do certain things, to direct the souls to move on the story.
Interesting. So I'll field Britton's 2 lasting questions. The first being, why is it that we never seem to focus on the latter 2 parts of the Divine Comedy in pop culture and academics?
Yeah, so that's not a good question. We talk always about Inferno, and then nobody wants to talk about Purgatory and Paradise. So I think the short answer to that is because gore and blood and gossip are always better, right? They're always more interesting. And Inferno is the place where Dante has more gore, more gossip too. You want to know why such and such ended up in hell, right? So the story is that much more interesting, that much more compelling. And all these souls either willingly or are tricked to tell their story of how they got there. So I think that's more compelling from the point of view of pop culture, of the presence of Dante's work in the Western culture. And I think that the latter part is because the language also is that much more, I want to say modern, but that's not really what it is. Meaning the kind of language that Dante uses for the Inferno, the first third of the Divine Comedy, is a lot closer to contemporary Tuscan, than the other two. The other two canticles are expressed in a much more refined literary language. And so from the very beginning, people got more interested in Inferno because of the gore, because of the gossip, but also because of the language and the imagery. They were a lot closer to what people like, right? All the demons, all those things. And then I think the last part is because Inferno is a very common motif in the decoration of churches. You have last judgments with devils and sinners being punished throughout Italy, throughout the church and cathedrals of Italy. So that's another thing where the words had often a ready illustration that people could connect to, and so that made them that much more compelling, that much more striking.
Interesting. I never thought about why we don't always include the second part. And so I guess the last question: why is Dante in his own story? And was it common to self-insert stories at the time?
Yeah, that's another good question. So it has to do in part with what we were saying earlier of trying to conjugate the individual and the general, the universal. I think it's also very good from a storytelling perspective. So I'm going to tell you a tale of the afterlife, and I'm going to tell it to you in the first person from my own point of view. So that's much more compelling. And the final reason I think is because it's an issue of authority. If I tell you that I saw it and you respect me because I'm a great poet, I'm a great writer, that story, the morals that it carries, will have that much more authority because it comes from me, right? And then throughout the Divine Comedy, in Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, Dante has many characters that have authority, bestow authority on him. The very first one is Virgil, the greatest poet of classical Latin poetry. Dante always refers to him as his master, his teacher, but then oftentimes Virgil reproaches him for being too humble, for being too deferent to him. And the play there is Dante is establishing his own authority by having Virgil say, oh, but you're a good poet too. You shouldn't beat yourself up too much, right? You're not that bad. And that is a way of increasing the authority that Dante has as a character, but ultimately also as a poet and as the moral authority behind the Divine Comedy. I mean, this man sets out to judge the entirety of humanity, right? He's basically being the one saying these people are condemned forever. And that's a very sketchy thing to do if you set out to do it. And so you want to use any trick in the bag to make sure that people don't question your authority. Don't start saying, like, who are you to say that Celestine V is relegated to that antechamber of hell, as we were saying.
Gianluca, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture and a lot of informative answers as well. You've given us so much to discuss for the rest of the week. That was great.
Thank you all for your interest in Dante and for the kind invitation. As I say, it's always a joy to talk about Dante, and your questions were wonderful. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rizzo. It is a fun lecture. So thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool. I will stop recording.